What's going on, everybody? First off, apologies for my disheveled appearance. I am getting ravaged by spring allergies, and I think I have a cold or something, which is making this part of the research process a little bit less fun. But I wanted to make a little bit of an update because we're getting closer and closer till the end of, or to the end of the semester, which means that I need to have some research done. And so, what I wanted to do first, I'm going to share some of the research that I have done, and by that I have roughly 8 pages written so far as the start of my rough draft. It has no intro, has no conclusion, anything like that. It's just a lot of the content that I'm deciding to talk about. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about what I had to do this week because I ran into a very interesting issue because I was doing a lot of my reading, a lot of my research on Sunday night. And I have weekly meetings with my professor on Monday to talk about where we've come so far in our research, how it's going, and stuff like that. And I was doing my research. I was doing a lot of reading, specifically into race relations within the Panama Canal Zone and how it would pertain to malaria, because I already read a lot of my malaria sources and, the treatments that Gorgas enacted and stuff like that. And so I was reading through these race monographs, journal articles, stuff like that. And I came to a really scary realization, especially when I think this paper's due in like 3 weeks, maybe not even 3 weeks, like 2.5 weeks. I came to the realization that there's not as much of a link as I thought there would be. After all this research, obviously I can make my own links. There's definitely a couple like super strong links, which I have in my paper already, but there wasn't as many as I thought there was. And it kind of sent me into a spiral because this paper has to be like probably 25 pages, I think is what I'm shooting for, 25. And so I was like, okay, how do I tell my professor that there's less than I thought? And so I went to the meeting on Monday, a couple of days ago, and I was like, hey, man, I, excuse me, I talked to him. I was like, hey, this is what I've done so far. This is the stuff that I read through. This is some really interesting stuff, about like the labor systems and all of that. Because like this is supposed to be malaria paper. I'm getting a lot of good racial stuff about the labor program, which is not entirely what I'm interested in. I'm going to include it. I'm going to include a lot of it because we'll get to that in a second. But I was like, hey man, this is what I found out about the malaria stuff so far with race. Like there's a couple good connections. Let me tell you about it. And there's a couple good connections with the labor system. Let me tell you about that. But there is an issue, and I don't think there's enough content for this. And so I'm wondering how I can pivot through this. And he's like, well, like let's think this through, because these are quick meetings. So I'm like, okay, let's think this through. Let's think it out loud real quick. I have some good information on race with malaria. I also have some good information about the environment. I have some good information on education. Would it be okay if I wrapped it all together? If I basically said the malaria is this big umbrella, and then underneath it is how it affected each thing individually: race, education, and environment. And I was like, because that's me hedging my bets. It's basically saying I can't find a ton of sources in this amount of time that I still have left because my rough draft is due on Monday. It's supposed to be at least 20 pages. It's supposed to be a rough draft, like have the majority of your paper settled down. I was like, that was my gambit there. I was like, will he think that's a good idea? And he responded to me, or he was like, yeah, that sounds great, actually, like getting a very interest in perspectives. And so I was relieved. I was like, okay, my pivot succeeded. I can now basically, I think I have enough information to write at least a 20-page paper. But that was a very stressful thing for me to do, is basically go through the steps of realizing my research that I've done has been subpar to a certain point, or not subpar, but has not yielded what I need. Is it okay to kind of shift what I'm researching to make sure that to gather more things, to gather more things that I do need? And he was like, yeah, absolutely, that's fine. And so we pivoted successfully. Now we have about 9 pages of a paper done. I think it's 8 and some change. I just want to read it out loud because it'll be my first time reading it, because I started writing it on Sunday just to make sure I had something written down, and I just cranked out another 4 pages like 5 minutes ago. So I'm just going to read it to give you a little glimpse of like what I'm going to be talking about. There's no intro again, so this just starts right in the middle of content. It starts with talking about Gorgas. Let's go. When William Crawford Gorgas finally arrived in Panama in 1904, he only just begun to grasp the tall tasks that canal construction would face. Equipped with only a team of 6 other doctors, the situation was grim, to say the least. Some leftover French infrastructure, such as the Ancon Hospital, would prove to eventually be helpful in starting a sanitation project, but the United States was practically starting at square one in every other regard. The environmental hazards of Panama had long been known, but observing the condition of Panamanian sanitation, or lack thereof, was still jarring for Gorgas and company. Upon arrival, Gorgas deemed Panama to be, quote, a mosquito paradise, end quote, with the climate and sanitation conditions. Swamps and marshes provide ample breeding grounds for mosquitoes such as Anopheles. An even bigger issue, however, was the vast possibilities for standing water, a crucial place for mosquito reproduction. French construction had left the landscape riddled with large holes. The wet season frequently eroded the bottoms of hills to create ditches, and even something as common as drinking water all served to be critical mosquito risks. Following his precedent set in Havana, Cuba, Gorgas set out immediately to get a scope of the situation. He assembled a team directly after his first visit composed of health experts such as James C. Perry, Henry Rose Carter, and Claude Connor Pierce. Pierce, as a quarantine officer in the city of Cristobal, helped organize a medical survey of everyone and everything within the Panama Canal Zone. These thorough surveys that included evaluating buildings, bathrooms, food stands, and sources of drinking water eventually came to officially recognize 125 problems within the 244 surveyed structures that the Isthmian Canal Commission and the Public Health Service could work to fix. Gorgas and company decided to take a 3-pronged approach in handling the malaria crisis before it crippled the construction efforts. The first prong, and perhaps the most important, was the attempt to depopulate mosquitoes. This effort took shape in a variety of ways due to the sheer survivability of mosquito larvae and the mosquito's ability to repopulate with minimal water nearby. Gorgas knew from Havana that the best method of preventing mosquitoes from breeding in areas with water was to remove the water, or somehow make it inhospitable. He started by oiling the water or coating the surface where mosquitoes' eggs are to kill them before they hatch. This method was effective at preventing new mosquitoes from being born, but did nothing to stop the already living population of adults and the larvae. It also ran the risk of human error, with smaller puddles being easier to miss. Another method of prevention that Gorgas started in 1904 was the filling of holes, usually with concrete. Due to the nature of Panama's soil, the wet season, and the frequency of cattle movements, hoof holes and carriage holes were frequently used as breeding grounds for mosquitoes. They were, however, extremely shallow holes that Gorgas and the ICC believed could be solved through filling the holes and the paving of new roads, both of which ensured safer travel in less areas for mosquito propagation. The main disadvantage of this method was simply the time and money that it would take to fill the holes and create the new roads, versus just oiling the water or waiting for the hole to dry up, as many of the hoof craters usually did. For water sources larger than small holes in the ground, Gorgas implemented a method called drainage to try and eliminate the threat of standing water as fast as possible. This method was crucial in eliminating mosquitoes and malaria from the area, as it, when properly maintained, accounts for the influx of water during wet seasons. While it may sound simple, the engineering behind creating reliable drainage systems, vexed engineers enough to get the sanitarians to assist with the planning. Issues with drainage were almost entirely human error, as engineers on the project would frequently forget about the ditches made, destroying them due to a lack of maintenance, as well as the fact that improper drainage could be worse for mosquito propagation than no drainage at all, as it would just create more standing water sources. The actual creation of drainage was also a challenge due to the topography of the Panama Canal Zone. Hills with running water proved to be difficult to maintain because of their variable elevations. Gorgas and company knew that the ditches needed to be as straight as possible, with precise cuts as the outline so standing water could not form on the downslopes. This would not be enough, however, as the ditches could fill up from the wet season at any moment. Gorgas solved this issue by ordering weekly inspections of the drainage systems to ensure that water was not collecting and that no ditch went unsupervised. Drainage, however, presented its own unique issue: potholes. Created through the digging process, potholes were minuscule divots made through the erosion during the digging process. Due to their small size, they were nearly impossible to notice and even more difficult to manage. Mosquitoes only need roughly 1/4 of an inch of water to reproduce, so these potholes were a great opportunity for mosquitoes to sneak through the eradication effort of the drainage program. Even after the implementation of weekly inspections by Gorgas, potholes remained to be a thorn in the side of the ICC and PHS for the entirety of construction. While the efforts to control mosquito population was essential to controlling malaria, Gorgas led other efforts to ensure the health and safety of the Panama Canal Zone workers through his creation of an improved medical infrastructure. When the United States first arrived at the Panama Canal Zone, they saw the dilapidated remains of French medical infrastructure and immediately resolved to build upon and improve it. The primary example of this is their transformation of the Ancon Hospital. When Gorgas and the Sanitation Commission first arrived in 1904, the Ancon Hospital was described as downtrodden and of poor sanitation quality. Gorgas specifically took issue with the lack of preparation Ancon Hospital had taken to prevent the spread of malaria. He noticed that patients were primarily separated by race rather than their ailments, and that there were no mosquito screens to prevent entry. Gorgas' staff, namely Perry, Pierce, and Carter, jumped on this issue by both renovating the Ancon Hospital and beginning plans for the construction of numerous hospitals, sick camps, and, most importantly, quarantine sites throughout the Canal Zone. Through this quadrumvirate, the Panama... That's a goofy word. I need to take that out immediately. Through this quadrumvirate, the Panama Canal Zone was receiving preventionary malarial aid through screens and treatment options with camps and hospitals. Gorgas, however, decided to spearhead a third mission in his crusade, sanitary engineering. While the eradication of mosquitoes and the proper treatment of malaria both proved to be effective methods at containing the disease, Gorgas believed that with proper sanitation, or with sanitary engineering, the spread could be stymied to a point of near eradication entirely. Gorgas, with the instruction of Chief Engineer John Stevens, employed two major sanitary engineering projects early on during the construction of the canal: plumbing and physical infrastructure. During Gorgas' initial visit, one of the first things he noticed was the lack of indoor plumbing. Without it, the streets were flooded with wastewater, and local drinking water was usually collected rainwater, which could easily become contaminated with mosquito larvae. By 1906, he had installed running water systems in the majority of living spaces and hospitals, allowing for potable drinking water and the safe expulsion of wastewater. Moreover, the creation of clean drinking water meant that rainwater no longer needed to be contained, eliminating a major mosquito propagation problem in the local villages. While plumbing was crucial to the health and safety of Panama Canal Zone by getting rid of wastewater and providing clean drinking water, the creation of new physical infrastructure lended itself to stopping malaria. As noted earlier, there are many other methods of mosquito reproduction due to the unique topography of Panama. Within the Canal Zone itself, there are multiple marshes, wetlands, and grassy knolls that all contributed to the mosquito issue. Gorgas and Stevens' idea was to pave over these areas, negating the land's ability to retain the water. This was done through the construction of roads and aqueducts. Creating entire new roads and paving over marshes was an expansion of Gorgas' idea to fill the small holes with concrete, and yet this project increased the scope to cover large swaths of land. By the creation of concrete roads, travel by cattle and carriage would be safer and more efficient, with an added benefit that they wouldn't leave tracks in the wet ground, therefore limiting a prime breeding ground for the mosquitoes. While the introduction of these concepts of medical treatment, sanitation, and malaria prevention were all controlled by Gorgas and the chief engineer Stevens, the implementation in the Panama Canal Zone was not as successful, especially to the non-white workers. With the introduction of the United States to the Canal Zone also came racist ideologies exemplified within the labor system, medical treatment systems, and education system. The United States was no stranger to employing racially divided work systems when abroad, such as with their construction of the Panama Railroad in 1855. When the French started constructing their own Panama Canal in 1881, they used a prototype of divisive racial labor that would soon be built upon by the United States with their Panama Canal ventures, transforming into the gold and silver roll. In concept, the gold and silver roll labor systems were described by the United States not as a racially divisive system, but as a system that divided based on ability of labor. Laborers that were doing skilled labor will be on the gold roll, and laborers doing unskilled labor will be put on the silver roll. That veneer wore off quickly, however, and the gold and silver systems were seen as what they truly are: attempts to racially segregate the workforce. The gold and silver rolls are concepts born from a work policy formerly called the Third Country Labor Policy. John Stevens desired to implement this system in the Panama Canal Zone to encourage competition amongst the laboring classes, as well as to shift credit and blame wherever it needed to go at a particular moment. The key requirement to implement the third country labor system is to have 3 different types of people working on the same project. It requires an employer nation, the nation that's realistically funding both the project and the laborers, a host nation that is the primary location of the project, and a third nation that will comprise the majority of the workforce. When John Stevens took the spot of chief engineer of the Panama Canal Project, this was his vision from the beginning. In the early stages of construction, many Americans, and specifically many white Americans, were afraid to travel down to Panama to start construction. Stevens therefore looked elsewhere and landed upon the Caribbean as the perfect place to recruit labor. Since the canal had already had American and Panamanian laborers, but in fewer numbers, Stevens believed that the West Indian workers could fill the final nation in the third country labor system, playing the role of alien. Within the labor system, the alien is the backbone of the project, making up the majority of the labor force and driving the project along. The alien also, however, absorbs all of the ire of the other two nations. They are intentionally disadvantaged compared to the workers from the host and employer nations, and typically enjoy less rights and status. If the project suffers setbacks and struggles, it is typically due to the aliens, but if the project succeeds, it is due to the hard work and determination from the employer and host nations. Obviously, in this system, the aliens will also make less, i.e. put on the silver roll, than the employer nation's workers, put on the gold roll. The gold and silver roll, however, defined more than just a worker's economic earnings. It defined their living experience. The disparities between the gold roll and silver roll immediately show when evaluating their living conditions. Gorgas and Company implemented plentiful health measures into the Panama Canal Zone to try and prevent the spread of malaria, such as indoor plumbing, treatment centers, and mosquito screens. Silver Roll employees, however, never truly reaped the benefits of Gorgas' efforts. Silver Roll employees to start had less living opportunities than Gold Roll employees, as there were 7 gold towns compared to only 5 silver towns. These 5 silver towns were all overcrowded and had the bare minimum plumbing and sewage systems, allowing for the exact situations that the ICC and PHS had spent millions of dollars trying to deter. There were no mosquito screens, and a decent amount of buildings didn't even have window coverings at all, so malaria infection was easy to obtain and easy to spread due to the overcrowding. The deficient living conditions were intentionally done by the United States to create a contrast between gold roll workers and silver roll workers. By having pristine living conditions and health measures for the gold roll workers, they could use pictures to spread propaganda and show that the sanitation program is working. On the other hand, the United States could spread pictures and other false information about the silver roll living conditions, using that as a basis for more control in the canal zone and more funding for sanitation projects. Differences between silver roll and gold roll did not stop at living conditions, it extended to medical treatment. While the hospitals were technically open for all to use, it was a system that heavily favored the white Americans that lived on the gold roll. Patients were not admitted into the hospital unless they could pay the exorbitant fees involved with malaria treatment, not including the primarily white government workers, such as sanitation officers, who received free treatment, which included a vast majority of the silver roll workers. While publications at the time lauded the Panama Canal Zone hospitals like the Ancon for being all-inclusive, the numbers tell a different story. Take 1907, for example, where there were roughly 24,000 people working directly on the canal, not including government employees such as sanitation workers, with over 75% of those being West Indian. Many silver workers at the Panama Canal would have to attend separate silver hospitals and sick camps, guaranteeing a difference in the treatment compared to the gold camps and hospitals. The United States run hospitals reported on average that they discharge around 18,000 white patients per year compared to 12,000 non-white patients. That means, on average, if you look at the amount of white employees working on the canal, it is extremely likely that if a white canal worker got sick with malaria, they would be treated immediately at a United States hospital. If one of the 18,000 West Indian canal workers in 1907 came down with malaria, however, they would be extremely less likely to receive hospital treatment. The disparity in treatment goes beyond the hospitals and into the dispersal of malarial treatments like quinine. Once again, sources post-construction lauded the dispersal of malarial treatment as a great success that ensured the health of all workers, but the numbers don't support an equal dispersal either. By the end of construction in 1914, the United States hospitals reported that they had dispersed malaria treatment to 311,000 white people and 322,000 to non-white people. While that may look even at eye level, once again it needs to be recognized that there were significantly more non-white, especially West Indian, workers at the canal, as well as taking into account the large Panamanian population living within the canal zone itself. Taking the populations into account, while the treatment may seem equal in the beginning, it is clear that the United States continued to favor treatment of the white worker and the citizens of the canal zone. that is all I have so far. That was about 8.5 pages or so. Near the end, I started riffing because I actually started caring about it, and I started actually like, again, I think you could tell that the first 4 or 5 pages are just required. That's like my required background for the entire thing. That's basically what you got to know before we even get into this. But then it pretty quickly devolves into, hey, the United States is messing up. This is what the United States is doing wrong with all the race treatment. But I hope you found that a little interesting. I will probably not read my rough draft. I'll probably read my final draft when it's done. I have my mock draft due on Monday. This will probably be done by then, hopefully close to 20 pages or so. Because I think I can, obviously I still have to do an intro. I'm probably doing a little bit of a background coverage on how the French failed their construction, specifically how their malarial treatment was not up to par. I still have to talk about the education. I have to talk about the environment still, and those can both take at least a couple of pages when you talk about the Gatun Lake being a created lake, and then when you talk about the U.S. creating Balboa through their paving the marshes project. I think I can probably stretch it to 20. I probably can stretch it to 20, and we'll see where we go from there. But if you found this interesting, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you did not get too annoyed by my sniffling or coughing, because I apparently am allergic to plants. Thank you all. I'll see you all later with more research updates, probably.